Hello there, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Monday, the 11th of September. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 565 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will take a look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has said that Ukraine's place is in the EU during an unannounced visit to Kyiv earlier today. Ukrainian intelligence services claim the country has recaptured oil and gas drilling platforms near the shores of occupied Crimea in the Black Sea. The Russian news agency TASS has reported that Vladimir Putin has arrived on a two-day trip to Vladivostok to attend the Eastern Economic Forum. Kim Jong-un is reported to be on a train to Russia to meet Putin while he is in the region. A Kim-Putin meeting is possible as early as tomorrow. President Volodymyr Zelensky paid his condolences to the families of two foreign aid workers whose van was hit by a Russian anti-tank missile in Donetsk. The Ukrainian president said Anthony Ignat of Canada was killed on Sunday and that it was likely that Emma Igual from Spain also died in the attack. Two other volunteers, Moik Ruben, a German citizen, and Johan Matthias, a Swedish citizen, were seriously injured and are being treated in hospitals in Dnipro. Sergei Lysak, the governor of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, reported today that there were no casualties in the region overnight, despite Russian attacks. He said Ukrainian air defences shot down 11 Shahed drones over the region. TASS is reporting that Ukrainian forces have transferred a large amount of equipment, heavy weapons and a large number of Ukrainian armed forces personnel to Avdiivka in preparation for attacks on Donetsk. Rheinmetall has reached an agreement to supply Ukraine with a further 40 Marder infantry fighting vehicles. Ukraine's summer offensive probably has a reasonable amount of time, probably about 30 to 45 days worth of fighting weather left, according to General Mark Milley, the head of the US military. The US Deputy Secretary of State has said that Washington is impressed by the Ukrainian counter-offensive. Victoria Nuland, the deputy to Antony Blinken, said Russia's defences were on the largest scale seen in 100 years. Ukraine's newly nominated defence minister, Rustem Umerov, has called on Kyiv's partners to increase deliveries of heavy weapons to support the counter-offensive against Russian forces. We are grateful for all of the support provided. We need more heavy weapons, Umerov said. And residents and Ukrainian activists have alleged that Russian poll workers made house calls with armed soldiers, detaining those who refused to vote in the sham elections that Russia is imposing on the occupied regions of Ukraine. People were being pressured to write explanatory statements, which they fear will be used as grounds for criminal proceedings against them. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by a regular contributor to the programme. Linda Fabiani served as the SNP member of our Scottish Parliament representing East Kilbride from 1999 until she retired at the Scottish election in 2021. When Linda retired, she was the Deputy Presiding Officer of the Parliament. Linda, good evening. How are you keeping?
Absolutely grand. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Well, it's grand to see you. Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening. Our first story this evening is that a parliamentary researcher in contact with a series of senior Conservative MPs has been arrested for allegedly spying for China. The man is a British national in his 20s who worked in Westminster and had a parliamentary pass. He was arrested in March in Edinburgh under the Official Secrets Act, with another man in his 30s detained in Oxfordshire. Both men have been bailed until next month. The details of the allegations have not been disclosed, and the former researcher, who has not been named, released a statement through his lawyers earlier today saying that he is completely innocent. It is also not known what, if any, information the man may have potentially had access to. He is believed to have been in contact with senior Tory MPs, including Alicia Cairns, who chairs the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, and Tom Tugendhat, the Security Minister, although in the case of Tugendhat, the contact was before he became a minister. Some Conservative MPs have expressed anger at the idea that a spy for China may have been operating inside Parliament, but they were not told about it until the arrest was revealed in the press over the weekend. A handful of MPs are understood to have known, but had been asked not to divulge the information. There have been calls by some Conservative MPs for the UK government to designate Beijing as a threat, rather than the current term of a strategic challenge. However, this seems very unlikely, especially following James Cleverly's visit to Beijing last month. He's the first UK Foreign Secretary to do so in 5 years. So, Linda, if this young man is found guilty as charged, like Philby and the Cambridge spies before him, he's a shocking example of right under your nose espionage. By the same
Mhm.
token, if he's not found guilty, it's the most extraordinary throwing to the wolves of a young man. So, firstly, should we be surprised by allegations that China is seeking to influence politics in London?
Absolutely not. We certainly shouldn't be surprised that China either tries to influence or does influence. And not just in the UK, I think it's worldwide. It's what China, and remember, the Communist Party and the Chinese government are one and the same thing. It's what China does. And we're all, everyone who's ever worked in government or worked in politics is aware of that. You just have to look at China's operations across the world to recognise that that's the case. Their influence currently in African countries, for example. I mean, I often look at that and see China builds parliamentary complexes, they build public buildings for at their own cost for governments in other places in the world. And, you'd have to be terribly naive not to think that there was some level of espionage or potential espionage going on there. Because what China does is they don't go and employ local people. They go in entirely with their own teams of Chinese workers, with no overseeing or governance. I mean, I have to say too, that these things have been talked about in the UK for a long time. Not just about the idea of Chinese espionage, which sounds terribly like something out of a film or out a book, but intelligence gathering going on. I mean, even in the Scottish Parliament, I was chair of the Tibet cross-party group for a long time. Thankfully, that that's still going on under Ross Greer. But I was very, very often being given a row, shall we say, by the Chinese consul or the Chinese ambassador to the UK, constant complaints to the Parliament about what I was doing and how dare I. They are very, very up there in pushing the Chinese line. We all know that there's human rights abuses go on. They don't like to talk about it. There's been concerns for a long time about the Confucius Institutes in Scottish schools, for example,
Mm,
and
mm.
universities. What I will say though is there is a reluctance with the UK government and indeed the Scottish government to come down hard on China in any way because they're so ultra sensitive. And in a way, I understand it. We have big business links with China. We have, thousands of Chinese students come to our universities. So I can understand the reluctance, but there must be a compromise here in terms of calling out the abuses and recognising that China does interfere in the affairs of other countries. And, it would be incredibly naive to pretend that's not happening. Having said that, I'm pretty sure there's Brits across the world that are passing information back to the Brit government as well. That is the way of diplomacy, if you want to call it that. It's part and parcel of it.
Yes, it's a good point you make in terms of diplomacy, given that the UK spying agencies are controlled by the Foreign Office, so that link is pretty clear. And I was just wondering, do you think is working for a foreign government, lobbying or working in Westminster, is that any different to lobbying for big oil or the financial services industry?
Ooh, well, I guess it depends. It's that fine line between the lobbying for your government and spying. If you're lobbying for your government, everybody knows what you're doing, everybody knows what you're about. I guess if you're spying, there's a lot of subterfuge going on there, so nobody knows what you're actually doing. So that would be a very, very basic difference between the two things.
That's, that's a good way of looking at it. Thanks, Linda. We'll move on to our next item now, because an announcement by the Lord Advocate that it would not be in the public interest for people using a pilot safer drug consumption room to face prosecution for possession within that facility has been welcomed by the Drugs and Alcohol Policy Minister, Elena Whittam. Dorothy Bain Casey's indication that she would issue a public statement of prosecution policy removes one obstacle to establishing the first official safer drug consumption facility in the UK. It follows her independent consideration of a detailed proposal for a pilot developed by Glasgow City Health and Social Care Partnership and Police Scotland and facilitated by the Scottish Government. Today's news means that the Glasgow City Health and Social Care Partnership can take plans to establish the facility to Glasgow's City Integration Joint Board for approval. The Drugs and Alcohol Policy Minister, Elena Whittam, said, "I welcome the position that the Lord Advocate has taken. Glasgow authorities may now progress their proposal to set up a facility which can operate within the existing legal framework. While the service would still be limited to some extent due to the Reserved Misuse of Drugs Act, we are confident it will save lives. This is not a silver bullet, but we know from evidence from more than 100 facilities worldwide that safer drug consumption facilities work. It is now time to see this approach piloted in Scotland. It's vital that this pilot has the full confidence of the general public, as well as those who use the facility, and the leadership of Glasgow and Police Scotland will help ensure it is introduced as quickly as possible. Through our £250 million national mission, we are doing everything within our powers to tackle drug deaths in Scotland. However, the number of deaths is still too high, and we must use every means at our disposal as we face future challenges, including the increasing threat from synthetic opioids." So, Linda, firstly, does this latest development highlight that the entire so-called war on drugs and the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, yes, the act is almost as old as I am, and I'm very old, the act is the manifestation of the patently useless policy. So does that suggest to you that the legislation across the UK is long overdue for significant reform from the ground up?
Well, it does more than suggest. I've believed that for many years. It's quite clear that current policy doesn't work. So first of all, can I say well done, Glasgow, for having what could the word be? We're taking taking the steps to introduce this and to pushing the case, because I think the fact that they and indeed the Scottish Government are recognising that the misuse of drugs in terms of consumption is a health issue and not a criminal issue is really, really important. We're way behind other countries across Europe and the rest of the world in this. So well done to them. I'm interested in what the Lord Advocate has said. I'm concerned that it's taken so long, I have to say. But then I guess the wheels of justice grind slowly. But we're at where we're at now, and that's good. My concern is that this will be yet again something that Westminster decides to have a go at and uses their powers to override the views in Scotland, because some of the stuff that the Home Office have said previously about the potential of safe spaces in drug consumption rooms, is ridiculous. A range of criminal activities can be carried out, etc., etc. So I'm really concerned that Westminster, again, just stymie democracy in Scotland and block this. I do think, though, that the public is with the Scottish Government and with Glasgow City Council in this, and if they try and block it, they may find quite a backlash.
Thanks, Linda. And I was going to talk to you about the UK government approach and also the evidence from around the world. A Home Office spokesperson, who I think you were referring to, recently said There is no safe way to take illegal drugs which devastate lives, ruin families, and damage communities, and we have no plans to consider this, referring to overdose prevention facilities. Now, evidence from overseas is in favour of consumption rooms, and it's
Yeah.
increasingly strong. A number of studies indicate that the facilities reduce the risk of overdosing and have other social benefits. And services like this exist in a legal form in at least 13 countries around the world, including in Germany and parts of the US. And there are no known cases of a fatal overdose ever inside a consumption room in any of these countries. So, why do you think Westminster and the Home Office are contradicting all of this evidence from other jurisdictions around the world? Is it just more Westminster grievance politics?
Do you know, I've no idea why it is, Andrew. I've thought about it, quite a lot. I think the, they seem to think that public opinion is just anti-drugs, anti-drugs, anti-drugs. And it is to a certain extent. So it's as if they think that by agreeing on safe consumption rooms, they will have a disadvantage in elections of it because they have to be seen to be hard on drugs. I don't believe that's actually the case. If they were putting it across properly and making that distinction between those that use drugs, those that are addicted to drugs and have really terrible lives because of it, and are in danger, that's a health issue. And in fact, it's a public health issue. And if they would make that distinction between those people and those who are selling drugs, making big profits, through violence and everything else, and really taking advantage of people who are addicted, they could make that distinction. They could put money and resources into making that distinction. And I think people would then realise that for the greater good of society, this is something that should be done. So I don't think there's any great philosophical thought behind what UK government's doing here. It's entirely about thinking they are on public opinion and it's demonising those who are most vulnerable. And this particular government does that right across aspects of society. It's quite abhorrent.
Thanks, Linda. That's a very good point. Very well made. Thank you. We'll move on to a related story now because Jimmy Paul has now been appointed as the next head of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit, the SVRU, leading the unit in its work to identify innovative, evidence-based solutions to prevent violence across Scotland. Part of Police Scotland and directly funded by the Scottish Government with an annual budget of more than £1 million, the SVRU is a national centre of expertise on violence which uses a public health approach to address the underlying causes. Jimmy Paul will head up a team made up of police officers, civilian police staff, and people who are experts by experience to work with partners across health, education, social work, housing, and many other fields. Mr. Paul has experience managing health and social care services in care reform, most notably acting as the co-chair of the Independent Care Review in Scotland and leading charities. He recently completed his tenure as the director at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Scotland. Building on the historic legacy of the SVRU, Jimmy Paul will spearhead strategic initiatives aimed at reducing violence and its associated harms across Scotland, as the unit becomes a partner in the delivery of the Scottish Government's Violence Prevention Framework for Scotland, which was launched earlier this year. Mr. Paul said, "I am incredibly proud to begin my tenure as the head of the SVRU. Violence is a deeply rooted issue that affects individuals, families and communities throughout Scotland, and the work of this unit is imperative to creating a safer Scotland. Alongside a dedicated and hard-working team, I am committed to working tirelessly to see this lasting positive change realised. By continuing to use a public health approach and in collaborating like never before, I am convinced that we can achieve this." The Victims and Community Safety Minister, Siobhan Brown, said, "I am delighted to welcome Jimmy Paul as the new head of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. The work of the SVRU is vital in developing and delivering Scotland's public health approach to violence prevention in Scotland. The Scottish Government is committed to ensuring people feel safe within their communities, free from violence, which is why we recently published our new plan to prevent violence across Scotland, providing more than £2 million of investment to support a range of preventative approaches. These include the work of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit, Medics Against Violence, and YouthLink Scotland to deliver No Knives, Better Lives, all of which offer services and support to prevent and divert people away from violence and to reduce harm. So, Linda, Jimmy Paul said, fundamentally, I want to ensure we are not just referencing those who have lived experience, but that they are at the heart of our efforts. So do you think, thinking about the previous story we were talking about, does that give us an indication of the approach that will be used in the drug death reduction strategy? The individuals who are affected directly by the underlying causes are at the very centre of the strategy that's implemented.
Absolutely. And I think it's always about looking at things in the round. Over the years, I had concern about, how some initiatives were carried out in isolation. But the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit is a good example of how you look at things in the round. And further to our last discussion, about drugs and the war on drugs and everything, and how we've had approaches that haven't worked. When we're talking about violence, violence is caused often by drug issues, and it's not about the poor souls that end up addicted. It's about those that are selling. It's about those that are trying to take advantage and make money out of people's misery. So that's where violence occurs, and we read about it day and daily. So I'm glad we're looking at these things in the round. I don't know Mr. Paul. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting him. But he comes with a very good CV, and after the Violence Reduction Unit, I followed it from day one, and I think the work that John Kernahan and Karen McCluskey did there in setting it up was absolutely fantastic, innovative. Now, I know, Andrew, you said, it was a national centre, but it also became an international centre. Uh, you know, Glasgow particularly was looked at from across the world in the way forward for violence reduction, and they're looking at violence reduction again as a public health issue in the round, the bigger picture. And the No Knives Better Lives campaign, for one, was hugely successful. So good luck to Mr. and his team in carrying this great work forward. Now, I know John and Karen had a police background. I think both of them, if I remember correctly. So here we have somebody coming from a different background. And I think the last director as well was similar. So we have a new approach here. And I'm sure that the work of John Cairn and Karen McCluskey and Niven Rennie, I understand, will be carried forward by Mr. Paul, and that he will listen to the people with lived experience of all these, all these different aspects of violence, but he will also listen to the lived experience of those who've been out in the street trying to fight this for many years. So good luck to him.
Very much so, Linda. Thank you. Now, the controversial voter identification rules introduced by the UK government led to racial and disability discrimination at this year's local elections in England, according to a damning report co-written by one of the former ministers responsible for introducing the rules. MPs and peers on the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Democracy and the Constitution published a report today which says that the new rules caused more harm than they prevented when they came into force in May, and they call for changes including the acceptance of a greater range of ID documents. The report was co-authored by Sir Robert Buckland, who was the Justice Secretary in 2021 when the bill to introduce the rules was first launched in Parliament, and who subsequently helped to vote them through. The committee is chaired by the SNP's John Nicholson MP and also includes Labour MPs and peers. The report says the current voter ID system is, as it stands, a poisoned cure in that it disenfranchises more electors than it protects. The authors found that polling clerks are more likely to fail to compare a photo ID to the person presenting that document if that person is of a different ethnicity. They highlighted the case of Andrea Barrett, who's immunocompromised and was blocked from entering a polling station after refusing to remove her mask for an identification check. The report says their decision in that instance was clearly discriminatory and potentially unlawful because they denied Andrea Barrett the right to cast a ballot purely on the basis of circumstances which arose as a direct result of her disability. The rules, which were used for a full election for the first time in May after a series of small-scale pilots, mean that voters now have to show photographic identification at the polling station. Boris Johnson introduced the proposals to Parliament in 2021, claiming they were designed to prevent potential election fraud, despite only 3 people having been convicted for identity fraud at polling stations in the previous 7 years. An interim study published by the Electoral Commission earlier this year found that at least 14,000 people had been denied a vote because they lacked the correct form of ID. Their full report is expected later this year. Anecdotal evidence in the all-party group report suggested some people may have been unfairly treated because of their race. While there is no evidence this changed the outcome of the local elections, the APPG report warns that if repeated at a general election, it could help swing the results of up to 16 constituencies. It also says that the rules are too reliant on decisions made by polling clerks and returning agents, which can be arbitrary and are not open to appeal. The report's authors call for ministers to broaden the type of documents that can be accepted as identification and to allow those who fail ID checks to sign a legally binding declaration instead, confirming their identity. They also call for more training to be given to returning officers. So, Linda, the report says the current voter ID system is, as it stands, a poisoned cure in that it disenfranchises more electors than it protects. But that was the intention of the legislation, wasn't it? That's what the Tories intended it to do. Jacob Rees-Mogg admitted as much back in May.
Well, it would certainly look that way. And when it was being brought in, those of us, and there were many who were opposed to it, it was largely because we had that suspicion. When you looked at, what you quoted, Andrew, about how few people were ever done for electoral fraud, and then you look at the result of this, and my goodness, put the tin lid on it, Rees-Mogg of all people, actually admitting that this was gerrymandering. I think it's very, very plain. And the Tories have got form in this historically. Those of us of a certain age will remember all the gerrymandering and the scandals that went on about, it was the Westminster Council at the time. Dame
Yeah.
Shirley Porter was famous for gerrymandering there. So that's what they do. They're quite happy to cut out a whole tranche of people who would not vote for them. And I think it's quite plain. This report is damning. Two things I would like to say here. First of all, if Labour get in, they can just do away with it. Just scrub it. And I was looking today at Labour's response to it. Yes, they were opposed to it coming in largely, though in a bit of a lily-livered way. But I noticed their spokesperson today did not say, "We will abolish this." She said, I can't mind her name, she said that we will look at the result of this and make a decision. So here, yet again, we have Labour refusing to address some of the excesses of the Tory government. So I think that's a real concern. The big concern is, in fact, the general election, because when you look at the low turnout for local elections and the effect that voter ID has had on that, and consider too the people that might not have bothered turning up to vote because they knew that they didn't have, the kind of photographic evidence that was required and didn't make an effort to try and get it, or in fact didn't hear really anything about it until it was too late. There's a lot of people there. There's a big potential effect on the general election that's coming up fairly soon. And I have real concerns about that. And the report says that this could directly affect particular constituencies and has disenfranchised more people than it has helped. So, bad practice by the Tories, and it should be called out by everyone else.
Thanks, Linda. South Lanarkshire's businesses deserve better than the pro-Brexit Westminster parties, according to the SNP's business ambassador Ian Blackford MP and the Scottish Government Cabinet Secretary Neil Gray MSP, who were on a campaign visit to Rutherglen and Hamilton West. Neil Gray and Ian Blackford joined the local by-election candidate Katie Loudon in Burnside today to speak to small local businesses about the issues they face. Since Brexit, South Lanarkshire has lost a staggering £146 million of EU imports and exports, as well as almost £10 million in direct EU funding. Ian Blackford said, Westminster has trashed the UK economy and inflicted long-term damage on business across Scotland, South Lanarkshire and Rutherglen and Hamilton West. They deserve better. Leaving the EU has contributed to food inflation soaring and left businesses facing uncertainty and expensive red tape. But Keir Starmer and Anna Sarwar are happy to ignore reality as the Labour Party continues to back Brexit. A vote for the SNP's Katie Loudon in the upcoming by-election is a vote for a strong voice at Westminster, standing against Brexit and Westminster policies that are damaging to our local businesses and community. Katie Loudon said, while the SNP Scottish Government are championing businesses here in Rutherglen and Hamilton West with policies such as the New Deal and Shop Local campaign, Westminster's cost of living crisis and Brexit is causing long-term damage. Small businesses who make up the backbone of Scotland's economy have particularly felt the brunt. So, Linda, the largest industrial park in Scotland is at Moss End and is called Eurocentral. The clue is somewhat in the name, but since Brexit, South Lanarkshire has lost £146 million in EU imports and exports, as well as direct funding of about £10 million. So, do you think is Brexit resonating with voters now, or are they beginning to tire of it as an issue?
I think it's starting to resonate. I think it's been a slow burner, because people are, people are beaten down by everything that's been going on, courtesy of the UK government. It was Brexit and everything that went along with that. Then it's been, fuel costs, cost of living increases, inflation. And people have just been beaten down by it. But I think there's a growing recognition now of the effect that Brexit has had. 146 million, across Lanarkshire. Lanarkshire, you know, has pockets of deprivation that are amongst the worst in Scotland. And, for a few years now, we've had a Scottish government who has tried to make some of that better. And they've just again been stymied at every turn by Brexit. £10 million direct funding that hasn't come to Lanarkshire. I used to represent a part of South Lanarkshire, and we saw it directly what the effects of Brexit were. So people are now starting to recognise it. They're recognising it in bigger companies, like the supermarkets and things where there's issues with some foodstuffs, etc. Which I know we've gone into other times in this programme. But they're out also now starting to recognise it in smaller companies as well. They're starting to see it from their neighbours and their friends, from their employers. So, yes, I do think it's resonating. A dawning recognition of just what a ridiculous decision this was, and a recognition that Scotland was opposed to Brexit, but it didn't matter. And I haven't been much on the doorsteps in Rutherglen and Cambuslang, but I understand from those who have that yes, this is an issue. As is, the fact that the Labour candidate is saying he'll make these points known to Keir Starmer. Aye, very good, and a lot of good that'll do you. A lot of good that'll do Lanarkshire and Rutherglen and Cambuslang. Because again, Labour are just, Keir Starmer has just backtracked on everything. And, isn't even making promises that they're going to break. They're not making any promises at all. They're going to do nothing about it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Linda. Now, businesses are pulling back on hiring and slowing their output under the strain of rising borrowing costs, according to a study that gives a further signal that the Bank of England could limit future interest rate rises. A modest pickup in manufacturing in August failed to prevent a slowdown in broader UK private sector economic activity, a survey of businesses by the accountancy firm BDO has found. City traders have cut their expectations for further interest rate rises. They forecast that the central bank will increase interest rates by 0.25 percentage points to a peak of 5.5% when its Monetary Policy Committee meets on the 21st of September. The bank has repeatedly raised interest rates in an attempt to reduce inflation, but is now expected to curtail this tactic in the face of a weakening economy. Expectations for policy tightening by the bank are now at their lowest since June, after a string of surveys this week showing a softening outlook for inflation and the Governor Andrew Bailey's comment that a peak in interest rates was much nearer. UK labour market data, due to be released tomorrow, is expected to show the jobs market slowing, with unemployment rising for a third consecutive month and employers cutting the number of job vacancies. So, Linda, do you think is it likely that there will be a further squeeze as more people lose their jobs and start to claim on universal credit because they're unemployed?
Well, do you know, Andrew, I wish I knew the answer to that because I'm not an economist and I read various economists and those that know about these things, and I get different views from all of them. So it's very hard for a layperson like me to say. What I can say though is that just by speaking to people and being around people, I recognise the issues, recognise the economy is weakening. You can see that from all the figures. And, you know, the fact that employers are cutting jobs, are not filling vacancies, I think is very, very apparent. I've heard that, across the board. People leave and they say, all right, we'll just manage. We maybe won't fill that. But also, there's an issue about sole traders who are going out of business. There's an issue about sole tradespeople who have decided that, the way things are, they will look for employment and to be an employee rather than to struggle, trying to carry out their business when people are feeling short of money and not spending. So there's big issues there. I hear other people saying, oh, everywhere's advertising job vacancies. No, everywhere isn't advertising job vacancies. Jobs are getting advertised that are part time and generally the lower paid jobs. So, yes, the economy is weakening. What the Bank of England will do about that, I have absolutely no idea. But I really would like the UK government to admit there's an issue, to recognise there's an issue, and look at international best practice about how we can improve on the situation that people are in. Will more people end up in universal credit? I would say so. And unfortunately, the UK government's record on helping people who end up on universal credit is not good at all. So poverty is not going to be alleviated.
Thank you, Linda. Now, foreign aid and rescue teams have joined desperate efforts to find any remaining survivors high in Morocco's Atlas Mountains as the death toll rose to 2,497 people 3 days after a powerful earthquake that has left many villages still inaccessible. Excuse me. Moroccan authorities have accepted offers of help from visiting search and rescue teams from Spain, Qatar, the UK, and the United Arab Emirates, but have yet to accept further offers of aid from other countries, despite the urgent nature of the disaster. Turkey, which experienced a deadly earthquake in February, has offered emergency response teams and aid. Its president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, said it would help with all means if its offer was accepted. The French President Emmanuel Macron told the G20 summit in Delhi that France stood ready to provide immediate aid, despite poor diplomatic relations between the two countries. Friday's 6.8 magnitude quake Morocco's deadliest in more than 6 decades, had its epicenter below an isolated cluster of mountainous villages 45 miles south of Marrakesh, shaking infrastructure as far away as the country's northern coast. The Interior Ministry announced today that the death toll was over 2,497, with 2,476 people injured. It is expected that the overall death toll will rise as rescue teams reach remote villages high in the mountains. Many such villages, clustered in the peaks of Al Haus, region south of Marrakesh, closer to the earthquake's epicenter, have been worst affected. Drone footage from local television channels shows traditional mud brick houses completely flattened. Civilian rescuers rushed to reach remote villages, although many villages across the peaks of the Atlas Mountains remain inaccessible. Villagers from across the remote Al Haus region said they had dug at the rubble with their bare hands to free their trapped neighbours, sometimes too late. So, Linda, the relatively shallow depth of the quake has apparently made it a great deal more dangerous, and the United Nations now say they believe it has affected up to 300,000 people. So that's roughly the entire population of South Lanarkshire. So that's an awful lot of people needing very urgent help, isn't it?
Oh, it's horrendous. I was listening to some reports today, and they're not even feeling that they're looking for survivors. It's about raising the dead from the ground, from what I understand. The amount of people that are already homeless, there's the aftershocks. Um, I heard a couple of aid workers today saying that people in Marrakesh are frightened to go back into their houses, so folks are sleeping on the street. Uh, absolutely, absolutely horrendous. Hospitals just bursting at the seams. Aid workers are now going in. The UK has gone in, and Spain, and I think it's Qatar and United Arab Emirates, as you said, are going in there. Others, I mean, I know France had the. I understand that, as you said, the Moroccan government has said that they don't need people to go from France, but France has given aid money to non-governmental organisations there to help. So we just can't begin to imagine either what it's been like or what's going to happen now. I mean, when you look at what happened in Turkey, there, that's
Mm,
still ongoing as well. Horrendous for folk, absolutely horrendous.
very much so. Thank you, Linda. Now, the First Minister Hamza Yusuf visited Stirling to meet TechScaler Hub startup business owners and learn more about the programme. Almost 400 of Scotland's tech startup businesses have been supported during the first year of the TechScaler programme. A total of 387 fledgling firms received assistance from the £42 million Scottish Government project, the most comprehensive of its kind in Europe, which provides free mentoring and advice to early stage business owners. The seventh TechScaler hub will open in Dumfries during this financial year, joining others already operating around the country and underlining the Scottish Government's commitment to innovative businesses. The 2023-24 programme for government includes an additional £15 million to support entrepreneurs from all walks of life. The First Minister said, "Growing businesses are fundamental to a thriving Scotland, and the Scottish Government I lead is committed to doing whatever we can to help businesses unleash the enormous economic potential of accelerating a fair, green and growing economy. We are taking action now in partnership with business to help stimulate sustainable and fair economic growth across Scotland." Linda, the First Minister said that growing businesses are fundamental to a thriving Scotland and that his government is committed to doing whatever it can to unleash the economic potential. And I wonder, we've been hearing a lot recently about the First Minister's approach to business in Scotland. And I was wondering, do you think, is there a significant or a discernible change from between this First
Mm.
Minister and the broad policy agenda pursued by his predecessor?
Aha, now there's a question. Um, I think it would be a wee bit unfair to say that Nicola Sturgeon had not been interested in business, because certainly I remember her talking about these things and startups and, carrying out initiatives in the tech side particularly. But I think, the last bit of her tenureship was very much about COVID and the pandemic and everything that happened there and, the aftermath of that. So it's difficult for people to remember what Nicola Sturgeon did prior to that because she did such a sterling job for the country over that period. So that's quite difficult to say there's a comparison. However, what I would say is I think Hamza Yusuf has really emphasised the importance of business, start-ups, small businesses, which are the backbone of Scotland's economy. He seems to have managed to get across a bit of mainstream media bias about the SNP being anti-business, which has absolutely never been the case. So I think this particular initiative, TechScale, is excellent. I think the fact that it's 7 hubs across the country is excellent because startups and business should be right across the country. It should be encouraging communities, whether that be in schools, colleges, and and then into business. So I think he's broken through that barrier and he's really working hard at it and he's gaining a lot of confidence. The sector is gaining a lot of confidence through him, and that can only be a good thing.
Thanks, Linda. That's a very good point, well made. Bute House, the official residence of the First Minister of Scotland, has reopened for business following essential repairs. External and internal work was carried out on the A-listed building, which is on Charlotte Square in Edinburgh and owned by the National Trust for Scotland. In addition to stonework and roof repairs, windows were refurbished and essential fire safety works carried out. Costs for the programme of works and any associated costs are expected to be published later this year. So, Linda, does a modern Scotland really need a Bute House?
Yes. And I think what you said is really important. People don't realise it isn't the Scottish Government, it isn't the First Minister that owns Bute House. It's the National Trust for Scotland, it's a charity. Um, So, yes, I think that the First Minister of our country should have a residence. We could argue about whether that's Bute House or whether it's somewhere else. But I think that, yes, they certainly should have. It's not just somewhere that the First Minister goes and lives in a big fancy house. There's a tiny wee couple of rooms right at the very top, which are the house, if you like, where the First Minister can sleep if they stay over and, and the family can be. But it's largely a premises where work is carried out. Uh, whether it be diplomatic work for visitors, whether it be meetings in private. And when I say in private, I don't mean that nobody knows about them because all the visitors to Bute House get recorded and the government has to make that information available. But it's about the ability to be somewhere when people can come together and talk privately. You can't do that in a restaurant. You can't do that in a big hotel. So, yes, I think it's absolutely necessary that the First Minister of Scotland is given the respect of having an official residence.
Thanks, Linda. Now, it has been announced that the world-famous scientist, Professor Sir Ian Wilmot, has died at the age of 79. Professor Wilmot and his team and the team he led at the Roslin Institute made world headlines when they cloned Dolly the sheep from an adult cell in 1996. Dolly can now be seen in the National Museum Scotland, where she has been on display since her death in 2003. In 2006, Professor Wilmot was made the first director of the Medical Research Council's Centre for Regenerative Medicine at the University of Edinburgh, and 2 years later was knighted in the 2008 New Year's Honours List for services to science. In a statement, Professor Sir Peter Matheson, the Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh, said, "We are deeply saddened to hear of the passing of Professor Sir Ian Wilmot. He was a titan of the scientific world, leading the Roslin Institute team which cloned Dolly the sheep, the first mammal to be cloned from an adult cell, and which transformed scientific thinking at the time. This breakthrough continues to fuel many of the advances that have been made in the field of regenerative medicine that we see today. Professor Sarian's family have asked that the media and public respect their privacy at this time. So, Linda, Dolly captured the public's imagination, which is no small feat for a sheep, and sparked at the same time public debate about the possible benefits and dangers of cloning. So, how much do you think did the cloning of Dolly transform scientific thinking and capture people's imagination? I'm reminded that the First Minister name checked Dolly in his speech outside our Parliament just the weekend before last.
Ah, well, I'll tell you what, our First Minister would be no more than a bairn when Dolly was, I was going to say born, but I guess she wasn't born. What was she created? It was fascinating at the time. It was like something out of a movie. And I'm stunned to think it was way back in 2003. No, when did you say? I can't remember when you said. Was it 2003? So,
She was
or it
cloned in
was
'96 and
2003
she
something. It
died
was
in
happened, wasn't it?
2003.
96. She died in 2003. So there you go. It
That's it.
doesn't seem that long ago. I'm fascinated by that because people still talk about it. There's still everyday references to Dolly the sheep here and there. And what worldwide fame um, Professor Wilmot brought to Scotland with that. And again, the innovation that we have in Scotland with our scientists has over the ages been absolutely incredible. And there we did it again at the Roslin Institute. And that has informed so much in medical science since that time. So, yeah, absolutely amazing. The public imagination is still there. And we were the first. Dolly was the first. And that will never, ever be forgotten. So, what a great man. Uh, and yeah, I can only echo what all his contemporaries have said about him and respect the privacy of the family.
Of course. Thank you, Linda. And I'm reminded that sitting in Edinburgh that, of course, Edinburgh University has been lucky enough to have a number of very successful and very senior scientists who have changed our lives completely. But James Clerk, there's only one statue of James Clerk Maxwell in Edinburgh
But,
on George
mm,
Street. Do you think that we recognise scientific research and technological innovation enough in our society? I'm thinking a little bit about the previous story we spoke about encouraging tech scalers.
um, do we recognise enough? I think certainly within their fields they're very well recognised. Internationally, our scientists are very well recognised. But you mentioned there's only the one statue, James Clerk Maxwell. Um, for too long, Scotland has had statues thrown up of folk who were instrumental in the empire, folk who were lords and ladies for no more than dint of birth. So I actually quite like statues. I like portraits, but I'd like to see more about those who've really changed the world. Uh, Rather than those, as I say, who by dint of birth end up privileged. Let's get shot of them and replace them with some real people, real achievers.
Well, it's a very good point that you make, Linda. I suspect Edinburgh University will start renaming buildings after the late Professor Sir Ian now, in the same way as they
Mm.
did with James Clerk Maxwell. And of course, erecting a statue to Sir Ian Wilmot in Edinburgh would simply increase again the number of male statues in the city.
Yeah.
Albeit there are attempts now to begin to correct that. The next statue will be a statue of Elsie Ingalls, the Doctor,
Mm.
and so there's a constant challenge. But I think it is an issue in terms of Scotland celebrating those who either choose to come to work in Scotland, as Professor Sir Ian did. He was originally from
Mhm.
Scarborough, I think. Uh, uh, but also our own homegrown scientists and researchers and technological innovators, and how important it is that we celebrate them and encourage them.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting you mentioned earlier about the emphasis that's been given on tech. There's long been an initiative in Scotland for STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I hope that I mean, I haven't been in Parliament for over 2 years now, but I hope that that's still getting very much pushed. And also, of course, encouraging girls and young women to go into these fields as well, because traditionally, I was going to say traditionally they haven't gone that way, but a lot of it's been about they haven't been encouraged to go that way. So there's a lot of work being done, and I don't know what the latest figures are, but yeah, we push that as well as the tech. And there's those that would say that some of the tech stuff is scientific too, because you have
Mm-hmm.
computer scientists, data
Absolutely.
scientists, and all that as well. That's the statues of tomorrow.
Absolutely. Thank you, Linda, because I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes and to make new programmes. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target to continue to pay our bills is still pressing. However, the generosity of our supporters has given us a little more time. We've now raised over £16,500, and so we are able to continue making programmes for the next few weeks, but our need to raise the remaining £13,500 is still really urgent. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter and Blue Sky at Broadcast Scot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. We will be back at 7 p.m. sharp tomorrow evening for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. Thank you to everyone who's been watching this evening, and of course, a very special thanks to our very special guest, Linda Fabiani. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you.
On this day in 1297, William Wallace and Andrew Murray comprehensively defeated the English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Murray subsequently died of his wounds suffered during the battle. And on this day in 1997, a referendum asked Scots two questions. The first was whether there should be a parliament for Scotland, and the second was whether that parliament should have the power to vary levels of taxation. 74.3% voted yes to the first question, and 63.5% voted yes to the second question. And of course, our thoughts are with the families and friends of the nearly 3,000 souls who perished on this day in Manhattan in 2001. Please look after yourselves, and please have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.